Pensions can be one of the biggest assets in divorce, as well as one of the most emotive and one of the most complicated. So if you want to feel more knowledgeable and more in control around yours or your former spouse's pensions, then this is the video for you. I'm Kerry Griffiths. I'm a financial advisor who works exclusively with divorcing women, and this is my YouTube channel, Willow Brook Lifestyle Financial Planning. I'm delighted to be joined by a guest today, Sarah Dodds, who is a solicitor in the family team at Kingsley Napley and a fellow pensions geek. So when I decided I wanted to do a video to give some updates on how case law has given us some more guidance in 2020 around pensions on divorce, Sarah was literally the first person and the only person that I thought of. So thank you, Sarah. I'm so pleased to have you here. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about yourself, Sarah?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm an associate solicitor at Kingsley Napley. I provide advice on divorce, matrimonial finance matters, also some advice in respect of children's arrangements. Advise on a broad range of things, but I do have a specific focus on pensions on divorce and how they should be treated. I think pensions geeks are a great term. I think pensions aren't particularly glamorous, are they? It's certainly not always a priority for some people, but they're actually really important in terms of the long-term financial futures for a lot of my clients.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, they're not glamorous, but God, they can have such an impact. And so complicated to understand. So while Sarah and I are both pension geeks, the reality is that the field of pensions on divorce has been a really tough one for the legal world. And the complexities that arise from having different types of pension scheme, from having couples who are different ages, where assets were acquired at different stages, all of those combine to quite a difficult scenario to be able to kind of extract out what should happen. So in 2019, the Pensions Advisory Group, who were a group of kind of cross profession experts, got together and produced a report to give us some guidance and some clarity around how pensions should be considered on divorce. And 2020 has been the year that we've been able to see how that guidance has played out. And we've got some case law now, and that's why I've invited Sarah along, so that we can talk about what we now know a little bit more about, what the clarity is, and just to pull out some key things from there. So we're not going to talk today around the basics about pension sharing on divorce, but I have done some previous videos on those. So go back and have a look at those if you're not aware, because we're not going to go into much of the terminology. We might just give a heads up on some of it. So that'll be worth going back and visiting. Instead, what we're going to talk about is how 2020 has been the year that we've got some more clarity, and what that clarity is, how that might apply to you. So the first one we're going to kick off with, if it's okay, Sarah, is one that's really close to my heart, which is, should we be thinking about equalising capital or equalising income when it comes to pension sharing? And you might think, as a client, as you know, kind of the layperson watching, that you'd get the same outcome from both of those. So what we're saying is, should you split the pot now so that it's fair, or should you be thinking about when you retire that the incomes there are fair? And actually, both can give some quite different outputs depending on how old people are, and just depending on what type of pensions they are as well. So I believe the case was WVH, is that right, Sarah? And do you want to tell us
that is correct? Yes.
Fabulous. By the way, what did we learn from that one?
So the judge started really by saying there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, but they did go on to endorse the comments made in the PAG report that in the majority of cases where there are a reasonable amount but not a huge amount of money, the focus should probably be on equalising income rather than equalising capital, because of the unfairness that can arise if you just look at capital values. So you've touched on that slightly, Kerry, in the sense that pension schemes are all different. Some focus on contributions to the pot, others are based on how much you earn, either at retirement or over your career average. It's difficult to compare them sometimes, as the way they're valued is just different. So often there can just be a slight wrinkle if you're just comparing straight capital values. And ultimately as well, at the end of the day, pensions are actually income producing. Yes, there's a capital value, but the point of them is to provide an income in retirement. So broadly speaking, as I say, there's always going to be some outlying cases, and they are flagged in the case. The judge indicated, where pensions are relatively small, where the parties may be a long way from retirement, or where pension pots are both, relatively simple pots. Personal pensions where the value is based on broadly what is in the pot.
Yeah.
Those, you may look at the capital values in those cases, but in a lot of cases it's fairer. And that idea of fairness and equality sort of run through decision making in respect of finances on divorce. And in a lot of cases it's fairer to look at what income may be produced and attempt to equalise that rather than the capital values. For me, my takeaway from the cases has been, on a practical level, make sure that the pensions are considered from the outset. Everyone understands the type of pension, how the values have been calculated, and then just think about the implications of sharing the capital equally versus sharing the income. Just really make sure that it's thought about, and not just, either, right, we need to divide the capital, or right, we need to think about income. Think about all the options.
Absolutely. And I would love to see a space where we get to where the schedule of assets, which if you're earlier in divorce and you don't know this yet, but normally you end up with kind of a sheet with all the different things that you've got on both sides, you and your ex and jointly. I'd like to see a point where actually maybe the pensions aren't even on there, that they are kind of considered separately because of that income producing side of things. And maybe we consider them when we're looking at kind of the spousal maintenance and that side of things. So yeah, we'll see how that develops. So
yeah, it can be confusing for sure for that reason, because it's, they have an intrinsic capital value, but actually they're designed to give you that income. So it can be difficult. As I say, it definitely has to be considered, and some sort of foresight has to be. People have to think about what might happen in the future.
Yeah, and it's about creating that awareness, isn't it? I think that's what I'm excited about, is the discussions that we're having around this. And I have quite a lot with Kingsley Napley, where we will just talk about, okay, where could this go and how might it look? And just that the door is open to have those discussions is just a real breakthrough. So Sarah, the second case, KMVCV, that covered pensions accumulated after marriage has broken down. And there's some more clarity now about if what you've got pre or post pension wise, what you've acquired pre or post, should be included in any separation agreement. Is that right?
That is right. Yeah, there is, the broad principle on this is really the same whether we're talking about pensions or other assets on divorce. Okay. For example, in inheritance, if there is sufficient money to ensure that both spouses' needs are met, then there can be some thought given to what we would call ring fencing assets that accumulated before the marriage or after separation. So those assets aren't shared between the parties. The pensions generally, I think, used to be ring fenced much more routinely than other assets. I think probably because they're not tangible. In the moment, my clients sometimes say, well, a house is a tangible thing, whereas a pension feels like something that's way in the future. Unless they're in drawdown, so unless you're getting income from them at the time that you separate, it's easy to say, well, that belongs to one party and one party alone, or at least to start to think like that. But that can really lead to unfair outcomes, as it often ignores needs. The vast majority of cases in reality are so-called needs cases, because the hard fact of the matter is, when a couple separates, it's really hard to make funds that once sustained one household properly sustain two households. So a needs case is where the assets don't exceed the needs of the parties, and it can be a struggle to work out how everyone's going to rehouse, where the income's going to come from. And the recent cases in particular, KM and CV, dealing with pensions, confirm that in a needs case, the focus really has to be on making sure both parties have what they need to live, not on ring fencing assets. So if a large part of the pension accumulated before the marriage, even if that's the case, if taking it out of the equation and saving it for one person's sole benefit would result in the other person going without, the ring fencing shouldn't be applied in that point. It should all go into the pot. Again, there's always going to be outlying cases that don't fit, but generally it seems that judges are really endorsing the recommendations of the PAG report on this point.
Fabulous. Okay, that's really good to know and understand, actually. And then the last one, Sarah, regarding offsetting. So there were some important cases raised in the WVH one we've talked about, also RHV, SV. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the conclusions around these?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've probably spoken about offsetting before, but just broadly, offsetting is where you would surrender some element of future pension and retain more capital now. Look, sometimes it's the only way because there's just not enough to go around. And I think it's fair to say, though, that the judges in recent cases do acknowledge that the general view is that pensions should be dealt with separately from other assets, if at all possible. That was certainly the recommendation of the PAG report, was to try and avoid offsetting where possible, because some unfairness can potentially arise. In the recent cases, the judges did acknowledge, there's nothing inherently wrong with looking at value of pensions and the value of other assets together and doing a comparison, but it has to be recognised and accepted that it's not necessarily an equal comparison. So we would sometimes say it's like comparing apples and oranges or apples and pears. It's all fruit, but it doesn't make it the same. Yeah. Valuing different types of pensions in order to compare them is difficult, and valuing different types of assets versus pensions is even more difficult. It's hard. Valuing a house, you get your estate agent round, or a surveyor, they come and view the property, they provide a view, whereas to value a pension, it's much more of a complex mathematical calculation. It's not something that I can do, and it depends on the different rules of the scheme. Often it can just be much more complex to do and to deal with. And even if you are able to deal with that, and you manage to get your actuary to review and provide you with a report, you often end up with one party then offsetting a pension benefit with an asset that's not liquid. Pension is not cash in the bank or realizable as a property is, for example, and that can lead to unfairness in itself. So I think the overarching view is that whilst you can look at everything as a whole to see the bigger picture, it's generally better to treat pensions separately to other assets.
Perfect. I think, as we know, it's just so bespoke, isn't it, Sarah? Each case is just kind of, there's different priorities for that particular family and their particular needs, and it's having this guidance in the background to ask the right questions of the client and give the right perspective.
Absolutely. Sometimes it is going to be the right decision to offset, for example. Yeah. Sometimes it's going to be the right decision to think about capital split rather than income. But you really need to think about how it applies in your case. And that's what I'm always suggesting to my clients. They think about the longer term financial impact on them. And that's where people like you, financial planners, can be really invaluable. What works for one person, one couple, won't necessarily work for another. So it just really needs, clients, I always think, need to understand what my legal advice, what the impact of that will be on them, and what their sort of future financial health looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a team approach, isn't it? It's kind of getting all of those experts to take a view on it as well. Sarah, thank you. You've been an amazing guest. I will certainly have you along again. Could talk pensions all day, and we've just kind of skimmed the surface here. So what I aim to do is I'm going to do a few more videos just breaking each of those down in a kind of more layman's terms, and talk about some examples and how they might play out in the real world in your certain situation. So look out for those in the new year, and I will be in touch again soon. Thank you all, and good to have you along with us today.